Before we begin, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Thank you. The Valerian High Command had dispatched exactly 500 warships to hunt down a single human, and Commander Zethic found himself wondering if that would be enough. It was a question that would have been laughable 3 rotations ago, before the incident at Kepler Station, before they learned what humans were truly capable of when cornered, before they discovered that everything the Galactic Council thought they knew about the species from Terra was catastrophically, fatally wrong. Zethic's 4 claws drummed against the command console as he reviewed the tactical reports one final time. The target was a human male named Jake. No family designation, no military rank, no titles of note. According to the Federation database, he had been a simple maintenance technician aboard a commercial freight hauler. Nothing in his profile suggested anything beyond the baseline cowardice the Council had come to expect from his species. The Valerians had learned to expect very little from humans in general. When they had first made contact with the Terran Federation 60 cycles ago, humanity had seemed almost pathetically eager to please. They offered trade agreements that favored their partners, accepted territorial concessions without complaint, and responded to every diplomatic slight with patience and compromise. Weak-willed, the Council had decreed, useful for labor and resource extraction, but lacking the backbone for true galactic citizenship. It was that assessment that had led to the Kepler Accords, a trade agreement so one-sided it bordered on exploitation. The humans would provide raw materials, agricultural products, and technological services to 12 different species in exchange for very little, really, token payments mostly. A few outdated star charts, some surplus medical supplies. The humans had signed without protest. For 60 cycles, the arrangement had worked beautifully. Human ships arrived punctually at designated coordinates, their holds full of refined metals, processed foods, and intricate electronics. They asked no questions when their compensation was reduced due to administrative fees or quality concerns. They lodged no complaints when shipments were delayed or lost entirely. It was the perfect relationship from the Valerian perspective. The humans did the work, and everyone else reaped the benefits. The only oddity was how the humans insisted on handling all deliveries personally. No automated cargo drops, no remote transfers. Always a human crew, always a face-to-face handoff. The Council had assumed it was some primitive cultural quirk. Perhaps the humans needed the validation of direct contact to feel useful. They were half right about the need for validation. The incident at Kepler Station had begun like any other routine transfer. A human freight hauler, designation Long Road Home, had arrived with a cargo hold full of processed titanium and rare earth elements. Captain Hector, a graying human male with tired eyes, had requested permission to dock and begin the standard offloading procedures. But there had been a complication. The Kepler Station commander, a Valerian named Vorthak, had decided to implement new security protocols. The human crew would be detained and processed through interrogation while their cargo was confiscated pending inspection. It was theft, of course, barely disguised piracy under the veneer of bureaucracy. But the humans had never complained before about such irregularities. What was one more transgression? Captain Hector had stood in the docking bay, watching as Valerian security forces seized control of his ship and began herding his crew toward detention cells. His weathered face had remained carefully neutral, but something in his eyes had made Commander Vorthak pause. "Is there a problem, human?" Vorthak had asked, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "No problem," Hector had replied quietly. "I was just wondering if you were absolutely certain about this course of action." The question had struck Vorthak as odd. What could a human do about it after all? They were outnumbered 50 to 1, outgunned, and trapped aboard an alien station. But something in the human's tone had made the commander's scales prickle with unease. "I am certain," Vorthak had said. "Your cargo will be extensively examined." Captain Hector had nodded slowly. Then he had reached into his jacket and withdrawn a small communication device. With deliberate care, he had broken it in half. The significance of this action had been lost on everyone present, including Vorthak. Only later would they understand what the broken communicator had meant. It was a dead man's switch, a fail-safe, a final message sent to destinations unknown, containing coordinates, status reports, and 3 simple words. Accords are void. But that was knowledge that would come too late to save Commander Vorthak, or Kepler Station, or the 537 Valerians who called it home. The human crew had been processed through detention with the same passive cooperation they had always shown. They answered questions when asked, submitted to searches without complaint, and offered no resistance as they were locked away in the station's holding cells. Jake, the maintenance technician, had been assigned to Cell Block C with 11 other humans. He was perhaps 30 cycles old by human reckoning, average height for his species, with brown hair and unremarkable features. His psychological profile marked him as compliant and non-aggressive. The guards had barely glanced at him as they sealed the cell door. For 18 hours, the humans had waited in their cells without incident. They spoke quietly among themselves, sharing stories and old jokes. Some slept. Others stared at the walls with expressions of resignation that the Valerians found entirely expected. The attack had begun at 0347 station time. Jake had been the first to move. One moment he was sitting cross-legged on his bunk, eyes closed as if in meditation. The next, he was standing at the cell door, running his hands along the locking mechanism with a concentration that bordered on reverence. The electronic lock had been military-grade, designed to contain even the most dangerous prisoners. It had 17 separate fail-safes, quantum encryption, and biometric scanners that could identify unauthorized tampering from 3 systems away. Jake had opened it with his fingernails and what appeared to be a piece of chewed protein bar. The process had taken him 47 seconds. He had freed the other humans with similar efficiency, moving through the detention level like a shadow given purpose. The guards had found their posts empty and their security systems reporting normal operations. It had taken them precious minutes to realize that 12 humans were now loose aboard their station. By then, Jake and his companions had already reached the armory. The Valerians had always prided themselves on their military hardware. Their pulse rifles could punch through starship hulls. Their shock grenades could disable entire boarding parties. Their powered armor turned ordinary soldiers into walking siege engines. The humans had taken one look at the weapons and ignored them entirely. Instead, Jake had begun dismantling the station's waste processing system. What followed had been 23 minutes of methodical destruction that would haunt the survivors' dreams for cycles to come. The humans had moved through Kepler Station with a precision that spoke of extensive planning and a cruelty that defied their reputation for pacifism. They had not killed randomly. They had not tortured for pleasure. They had simply removed every obstacle between themselves and their ship with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon excising a tumor. The fact that those obstacles happened to be living beings seemed almost incidental to their purpose. The worst part, from the Valerian perspective, was how the humans had used the station's own systems against its inhabitants. Waste processing tubes became weapons. Atmospheric recyclers became poison gas dispensers. Emergency bulkheads became crushing implements. Jake had demonstrated a working knowledge of Valerian technology that exceeded that of most Valerian engineers. He had turned their own home into a death trap with tools that were never meant to be weapons and knowledge he should never have possessed. When the surviving security forces had finally cornered the human crew in Docking Bay 7, they had found Captain Hector standing calmly beside his freed ship. His hands were empty, his expression serene. Behind him, Jake and the others had been loading the last of their confiscated cargo. "Stand down," Commander Vorthak had ordered, his weapon trained on the human captain. "Surrender now, and your deaths will be quick." Captain Hector had tilted his head slightly. "Deaths? You have murdered 312 Valerian citizens," Vorthak had snarled. "Did you think there would be no consequences?" "Oh, there will be consequences," Hector had agreed, "just not the ones you're expecting." It was then that the station's sensors had detected the incoming ships, not the small human freight haulers the Valerians had grown accustomed to, but something else entirely. Something that registered on their instruments as impossibly large and moving at speeds that violated several known laws of physics. The long road home had departed Kepler Station without further incident. Commander Vorthak had been too stunned by the sensor readings to prevent their escape. His weapons remained trained on empty space as the human vessel disappeared into hyperspace, leaving behind a station full of corpses and questions that would echo through the halls of the Galactic Council for cycles to come. The investigation had taken weeks. Teams of forensic specialists from a dozen species had combed through every meter of Kepler Station, trying to understand what had happened. How had 12 humans, 12 supposed pacifists, managed to kill over 300 trained soldiers without losing a single member of their own group? The answer had been both simple and terrifying. They had known exactly what they were doing. Evidence suggested that the humans had been studying Valerian technology, psychology, and tactics for the entire duration of their 60-cycle partnership. Every trade mission had been a reconnaissance operation. Every diplomatic meeting had been an intelligence-gathering exercise. Every show of weakness had been a carefully calculated performance designed to lull their victims into complacency. The humans hadn't been submitting to exploitation. They had been documenting it. But even more troubling than their deception was their methodology. The humans hadn't just killed their captors, they had done so with a level of systematic efficiency that suggested extensive training and preparation. These weren't panicked civilians fighting for their lives. These were operators, executing a mission with military precision. The implications had sent ripples of unease throughout the council chambers. If the humans had been planning something like this all along, what else were they capable of? How many other species had underestimated them just as badly? The answer had come in the form of Jake himself. 3 days after the Kepler Station incident, long-range sensors had detected a massive disturbance in the Proxima Centauri system. When scout ships had arrived to investigate, they had found the entire Dolan trade fleet, 37 vessels, floating dead in space. No signs of battle. No energy weapon discharge, no debris. The crews were simply gone. Security footage from the surviving ships had told a strange story. A single human male, identified as Jake from the Kepler Station recordings, had somehow materialized aboard the Dolan flagship. He had walked through the ship's corridors without weapons, without armor, without any visible means of inflicting harm. But every Dolan he encountered had simply stopped. Stopped breathing, stopped moving, stopped existing in any meaningful sense. Their bodies remained intact, their faces peaceful. They appeared to have died without pain, without fear, without even awareness that death was approaching. Jake had moved through the entire fleet like a plague-given human form, leaving nothing alive in his wake. When the last ship had fallen silent, he had simply vanished, leaving behind only the echo of a message broadcast on all frequencies. The Accords are void. We remember everything. The Galactic Council had convened in emergency session within hours of receiving the report. Species that had been exploiting human labor for decades suddenly found themselves re-examining every interaction they had ever had with the supposedly passive Terrans. Trade agreements were reviewed, security protocols were revised, military assets were quietly repositioned, but it was too late for such precautions. The humans had vanished from known space entirely. Their trade routes went silent. Their diplomatic missions were recalled. Their colonies in the Outer Rim simply emptied. Overnight, humanity had become a ghost in the galactic machine. The silence was more terrifying than any declaration of war could have been. For 2 cycles, the Council had waited for the other shoe to drop. They had monitored human space with long-range sensors, sent probe missions to investigate their abandoned settlements, and tried to establish contact through every available channel. Nothing. It was as if humanity had simply decided to erase itself from the galactic community. They left behind empty stations, silent worlds, and 1,000 unanswered questions about what they had been planning all along. Then the ships had started disappearing. It began with isolated incidents in the Outer Rim territories, a Valerian patrol that failed to report in, a Sleen merchant vessel that never reached its destination, an Altarian mining operation that went silent between shift changes. The pattern had taken months to emerge, but when it did, the implications were staggering. Every missing vessel had been crewed by members of species that had participated in the exploitation of human labor. Every disappearance had occurred in sectors that were supposedly beyond human reach, and in every case, the ships had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the faintest energy signature that suggested they had been there at all. The Council had tried to dismiss it as coincidence, pirates perhaps, equipment failures, random accidents in the vast emptiness of space, but the disappearances had continued, growing more frequent and more targeted with each passing rotation. It was the Jandis Collective that had finally broken the silence of denial. One of their medical research vessels, investigating a routine pathogen outbreak on a distant world, had sent back a transmission that had chilled the Council to their cores. The ship's sensors had detected a massive object lurking in the system's asteroid belt, something that registered as larger than a Valerian dreadnought, but moved with the stealth characteristics of a fighter craft. When they had moved to investigate, the object had revealed itself to be a ship of entirely unknown design. Its hull was smooth, flowing, almost organic in its curves. It generated no waste heat, no electromagnetic signatures, no gravitational anomalies that should have been impossible to suppress. And printed along its side, in letters that could be read from 1,000 kilometers away, was a simple message in perfect Jandis script. "We have not forgotten what you did to our children." The medical ship had attempted to flee, but its engines had simply stopped working. Not damaged, not destroyed, just stopped. As if some invisible hand had reached into their mechanical hearts and stilled them with a thought. The last transmission from the Jandis vessel had been a single, terrified whisper. "There's a human aboard our ship. He's not armed. He's not threatening anyone. He's just walking, and everyone he passes just stops." The signal had cut off abruptly, leaving only static and the growing certainty that humanity had been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone had imagined. The hunt for Jake had begun immediately. The Valerian High Command, in consultation with the Galactic Council, had assembled the largest single-purpose military operation in recorded history. 500 of the most advanced warships in known space, crewed by elite warriors from a dozen different species. They had tracking systems that could follow a single molecule across star systems. They had weapons that could crack planets. They had the combined military might of half the galaxy focused on a single target, one human male. Last seen in the Kepler system, armed with nothing more than his bare hands and an apparently supernatural ability to make other beings simply cease to exist. The irony was not lost on Commander Zethik. The same species they had dismissed as weaklings now required the largest military mobilization in galactic history to contain a single individual. But after the Jandis incident, after the disappearing ships, after the growing realization that they had been systematically deceived for over 60 cycles, no one was taking any chances. The fleet had spread out across 17 star systems, creating a net that no single ship could possibly slip through. Each vessel was equipped with the most advanced sensors available, programmed to detect the faintest trace of human life signs. They had contingency plans for every possible scenario, backup forces ready to respond to any threat. What they didn't have was any real understanding of what they were hunting. The first ship had disappeared on day 4 of the operation. The Talon's Edge, a Valerian heavy cruiser, had been patrolling the outer perimeter of the search grid when its beacon had simply stopped. No distress signal, no indication of battle, no debris field to mark its passing. One moment it was there, dutifully reporting its status every hour. The next, it was gone. Commander Zethik had ordered an immediate investigation. 3 more ships had been dispatched to the Talon's Edge's last known coordinates, their crews briefed on every possible scenario and equipped with backup communication systems. They had found nothing: empty space, natural background radiation, and a faint metallic taste in the local stellar wind that their sensors couldn't quite identify. But they had found the message, printed in perfect Valerian script across a nearby asteroid, carved with a precision that spoke of advanced technology and infinite patience, was a simple statement. Commander Zethic of the High Fleet, you are hunting the wrong prey. It was signed with a single human name, Jake. The second ship had disappeared that same day, then the third, then 7 more in rapid succession, scattered across the search perimeter with no apparent pattern or logic. Each disappearance was accompanied by a message carved into whatever nearby object was available. Asteroids, derelict stations, the hull of a disabled cargo hauler that had been drifting in system for cycles. Day 7. You have beautiful ships, Commander. I've always admired Valerian engineering. Day 12. The crew of the Stellar Fury fought bravely. They deserved better than the orders they were given. Day 18. Do you know what your government did to the colony ships we sent to New Geneva? I do. The messages had grown more personal as the hunt continued, revealing a depth of knowledge about Valerian military operations that should have been impossible for any outsider to possess. Jake knew the names of their crews, the specifications of their weapons, the details of classified missions that were buried in the deepest archives of the High Command. Worse, he seemed to know why each ship had been chosen for the hunt. The Stellar Fury had participated in the seizure of a human medical transport. The Void Dancer had destroyed a Terran research station. The Iron Claw had been present during the bombardment of the human colony on Theta Cygni. Jake wasn't just hunting them. He was trying them for war crimes they didn't even know they had committed. By day 25, the fleet had been reduced to fewer than 400 ships. The remaining crews were starting to crack under the strain of knowing that they were being stalked by something they couldn't see, couldn't track, and couldn't fight. Some captains had requested permission to withdraw from the operation. Others had suggested abandoning the hunt entirely and returning to Valerian space. A few had proposed using their ships' nuclear arsenals to simply sterilize every system in the search grid and hope they caught their target in the blast. Commander Zethic had denied every request. The High Command had been very clear about the mission parameters. Jake was to be captured or eliminated, no matter the cost. Too many questions surrounded the humans' abilities, and too many important people wanted answers. But as the fleet continued to hemorrhage ships with each passing day, Zethic was beginning to wonder if the cost was too high. The breakthrough had come on day 31, when the Shadow's Edge had detected an anomalous energy signature in the Barnard's star system. The readings were consistent with advanced human technology, something far beyond what the Terran Federation was supposed to possess. Zethic had ordered half the remaining fleet to converge on the coordinates, certain that they had finally cornered their quarry. 200 ships had jumped into the system simultaneously, their weapons charged and their crews ready for anything. What they had found was a single human vessel, small and sleek, hanging motionless in the space between 2 gas giants. It showed no signs of damage, no indication that it was trying to evade detection. It simply waited, as if its pilot was expecting them. "Open a channel," Zethic had ordered. The face that appeared on the main screen had been unremarkable by human standards. Brown hair, pale skin, eyes the color of deep water. But there was something in those eyes that made Zethic's scales crawl with instinctive fear. "Commander Zethic," Jake had said, his voice carrying clearly across the transmission. "Thank you for coming. We need to talk. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the Galactic Accords," Zethic had replied, though his voice carried little conviction. The Accords had been voided the moment Captain Hector broke his communicator, and everyone involved knew it. Jake had smiled, and for the first time Zethic had noticed the Predator's gleam in his teeth. "I'm not here to surrender, Commander. I'm here to negotiate." You are in no position to make demands, human. You are outnumbered 200 to 1. Am I? Jake had asked. Are you sure about that? It was then that the sensors had begun registering new contacts, dozens of them appearing throughout the system as if materializing from nothing. Each one was broadcasting human identification codes, but their energy signatures were unlike anything in the Federation database. They were ships designed for war, not the crude converted cargo haulers the humans had used in their previous conflicts, but purpose-built instruments of destruction that made Valerian dreadnoughts look like toys in comparison. Where did these come from? Zethic had whispered. We've been busy during our 60 cycles of peaceful cooperation, Jake had replied. Did you really think we were just sitting quietly while you robbed us blind? The human fleet had moved into attack formation with a coordination that spoke of extensive training and preparation. But they had made no aggressive moves, taken no hostile actions. They simply waited, as if giving the Valerians time to process what they were seeing. You've been planning this, Zethic had said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Planning what? Jake had asked. We haven't fired a shot. We haven't made any demands. We're just here. The missing ships, the crews that disappeared. That was you. Jake's expression had grown colder. Those crews participated in the systematic exploitation and murder of my people for 60 cycles. They were given opportunities to surrender, to explain their actions, to make amends. Most of them chose to fight instead. And those who didn't fight are still alive, somewhere safe, being taught better ways to think about the universe. The implication had sent ice through Zethic's veins. The humans hadn't been killing their prisoners. They had been converting them, re-educating them, turning them into... What? What do you want from us? Zethic had asked. Jake had leaned back in his pilot's chair, his hands folded calmly in his lap. What I want is irrelevant, Commander. The question is, what are you prepared to give? I don't understand. Let me be clearer. Your government has spent 60 cycles stealing from us, enslaving our people, and treating us like a resource to be exploited. You've taken our children, our worlds, our trust. You've murdered our colonies and laughed about it afterward. Zethic had felt his crew shifting nervously behind him, their claws scraping against deck plating in involuntary displays of agitation. The Council was operating under the assumption that... The Council, Jake had interrupted, was operating under the assumption that we were too weak to fight back. That assumption has now been corrected. So this is a declaration of war? Jake had shaken his head slowly. No, Commander. This is a declaration of justice. War implies that both sides have a chance of winning. The transmission had ended abruptly, leaving the Valerian fleet alone with their thoughts and the growing certainty that they were facing something far beyond their understanding. For 6 hours, the two fleets had faced each other in silence. The humans made no move to attack, but neither did they show any sign of withdrawing. They simply waited, as if they had all the time in the universe. It was Commander Zethic who had finally broken. The stress of losing ship after ship, crew after crew, had worn his nerves to the breaking point. He had seen enough death for 10 lifetimes, and the thought of watching his remaining forces get picked off one by one was more than he could bear. All ships, he had broadcast, weapons free. Take them down. The battle had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The Valerian fleet had opened fire with everything they had: pulse cannons, plasma torpedoes, anti-matter bombs that could crack moons in half. The space between the two forces had lit up like a newborn star as enough firepower to level continents had been unleashed at point-blank range. When the light had faded, the human ships had been untouched. Weapons that should have vaporized entire squadrons had passed through their hulls like shadows through mist. Energy blasts that should have boiled their crews alive had been absorbed, redirected, or simply ignored entirely. And then the humans had responded. They hadn't used energy weapons. They hadn't deployed missiles or torpedoes or any of the conventional instruments of space warfare. Instead, they had simply reached out. Invisible hands had grasped Valerian ships and crushed them like insects. Massive dreadnoughts had been folded in half by forces that generated no detectable energy signature. Crews had found themselves floating in space, their ships crumpled around them like discarded paper. Within minutes, the Valerian fleet had been reduced to scattered debris and emergency pods. The humans had made no effort to destroy the escape vessels or pursue the survivors. They had simply neutralized the threat and moved on. Commander Zethic had found himself alone in an escape pod, watching as Jake's ship approached with calm, predatory grace. The human had docked with his pod manually, the airlocks mating with a precision that suggested intimate familiarity with Valerian technology. When the airlock had cycled open, Jake had stood there in person for the first time. He was smaller than Zethic had expected, more fragile-looking, but there was something in his eyes that made the Valerian commander's blood run cold. "Hello, Commander," Jake had said pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind the accommodations. Escape pods aren't exactly designed for comfort." "What are you?" Zethic had whispered. Jake had considered the question seriously. "I'm what happens when you push a peaceful species too far," he had said finally. "I'm what my people become when you murder our children and steal our worlds and expect us to thank you for it." The Council didn't know. "The Council knew exactly what it was doing," Jake had interrupted. "You documented every crime, catalogued every theft, filed reports on every atrocity. You were proud of what you were accomplishing. You thought we were too stupid to understand what was happening to us." Zethic had felt his mandibles trembling with fear. "What are you going to do with me?" Jake had smiled, and Zethic had seen death waiting behind his teeth. "I'm going to give you a choice, Commander. You can come with me, learn the truth about what your people have done, and help us build something better. Or you can stay here in this pod and wait for your government to rescue you. And if I choose to stay, then you'll have plenty of time to think about the kind of universe you helped create. The pod has life support for about 40 days. After that." Jake had shrugged. Well, space is a very cold place to die alone. It hadn't been much of a choice, really. Zethic had followed Jake aboard his ship, a vessel that defied every principle of known engineering. The corridors were too wide, the ceilings too high, as if the ship had been designed by beings who understood space travel on a fundamentally different level. The technology was seamless, integrated, alive in ways that made Valerian ships look like crude mechanical contraptions. "How long have you been able to build ships like this?" Zethic had asked. "We've always been able to build ships like this," Jake had replied. "We just chose not to." It seemed impolite. They had traveled for days through hyperspace, passing systems that Zethic didn't recognize on star charts that showed no inhabited worlds. But Jake's navigation systems had tracked their course with absolute precision, following routes that seemed to exist outside conventional space-time. When they had finally arrived at their destination, Zethic had understood why the humans had vanished so completely from known space. They hadn't left the galaxy. They had simply stopped pretending to be weak. The system they entered contained a dozen worlds, each one teeming with human life and industry. Massive orbital shipyards stretched between the planets like metallic webs, producing vessels that made the ship that had captured him look primitive by comparison. The population readings were staggering. Billions of humans, all working with the focused determination of a species that had been grievously wronged and was preparing to set things right. "This is impossible," Zethic had breathed. "The Federation censuses showed human population at maybe 2 billion. You don't have the numbers for this kind of operation." Jake had laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The Federation saw what we wanted them to see, Commander. Did you really think we would show you our true strength while you were using us as slaves?" They had landed on the third planet, a world that buzzed with activity and purpose. Zethic had been escorted through facilities that stretched beyond the horizon. filled with technologies that challenged his understanding of physics itself. Humans worked alongside machines that seemed to think, building weapons that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But it wasn't the technology that had shaken him most profoundly. It was the humans themselves. Gone was the passive, accommodating demeanor he had come to associate with their species. These humans moved with purpose, spoke with authority, and looked at him with eyes that held the accumulated anger of 60 cycles of systematic abuse. They had shown him the records then. Every theft, every murder, every casual cruelty that the civilized species of the galaxy had inflicted on humanity during their supposed partnership. The data was comprehensive, damning, and absolutely undeniable. The colony ship New Horizon, carrying 15,000 human civilians to a new world, had been intercepted by Valerian forces and its passengers sold into slavery. The official report had listed it as lost in transit due to navigation error. The research station at Wolf 359, where human scientists had been developing new agricultural techniques to feed the galaxy's growing population, had been raided by Sleen military forces. The researchers had been murdered, their work stolen, their discoveries claimed by their killers. The official report had blamed equipment malfunction, resulting in total loss of life. The children's hospital ship, Bright Hope, carrying medical supplies to human settlements in the Outer Rim, had been destroyed by an Altarian battle group that had mistaken it for a military transport. The official report had never been filed at all. 60 cycles, Jake had said quietly as they reviewed the files. 60 cycles of systematic genocide, and your people called it commerce. Zethic had stared at the data streams in numb horror. We didn't know. The reports we received were lies, Jake had finished, written by people who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how to hide it from you. But why? Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you tell us what was happening? Jake had turned to face him, and Zethic had seen something terrible in his expression. Not anger, not hatred, but something far worse. Disappointment. Because we believed in the dream of the Galactic Council, Jake had said. We believed that cooperation was possible, that different species could work together for the benefit of all. We believed that if we proved ourselves trustworthy, if we demonstrated our value, we would eventually be accepted as equals. And now we know better. They had shown him the ships then, not the sleek vessels that had defeated the Valerian fleet, but the others. The ones that stretched for kilometers, bristling with weapons that existed partially outside normal space-time. Ships that could move between stars without using hyperspace, that could strike targets across galactic distances without warning. Ships that carried weapons designed not to conquer worlds, but to unmake them entirely. How many of these do you have? Zethic had asked. Enough, Jake had replied. We've been building them since the day we realized what the galaxy really thought of us. Every insult, every theft, every murdered child has been carefully noted and added to our debt ledger. A debt ledger? Every species that participated in our exploitation owes us a reckoning, Commander. Some debts can be paid with reparations and apologies. Others. Jake had gestured toward the fleet of impossible warships. Others require more direct forms of collection. Zethic had felt his legs give out beneath him as the implications crashed over him like a tide. You're planning to destroy the Federation. Not destroy, Jake had corrected. Correct. There's a difference. They had brought him to the command center then, a vast chamber filled with humans working at stations that monitored activities across the entire galaxy. Star charts showed the positions of every major fleet, every important world, every strategic resource that the Federation depended on for its survival. And at the center of it all had stood a human male who introduced himself simply as Thomas had shaken his head slowly. War implies that both sides have a chance of winning, Commander. What we're planning is more akin to pest control. The casual way he had spoken of galactic genocide had made Zethic's blood freeze in his veins. You can't be serious, There are trillions of beings across the Federation, innocent civilians who had nothing to do with... Innocent? Thomas had interrupted, his voice taking on an edge that made the air crackle with tension. Where were these innocent civilians when our children were being sold into slavery? Where were they when our colonies were being burned? Where were they when we begged the Council for justice and were told to be grateful for the privilege of serving our betters? Thomas had walked to one of the displays, bringing up images that made Zethic's stomach turn. Human children in chains, human scientists being vivisected in the name of medical research, human families being separated and shipped to different sectors of the galaxy like livestock. Every species in the Federation knew what was happening, Thomas had continued. They saw the reports, witnessed the atrocities, and chose to look the other way because it was profitable. They are complicit in every crime committed against my people. But surely you can't condemn entire civilizations for the actions of their governments, can't we? Jake had asked, stepping forward to join the conversation. When the Valerians were enslaving our children, where were the Valerian citizens demanding justice? When the Sleen were conducting medical experiments on our people, where were the Sleen protests? When the Altarians were destroying our ships for sport, where was the Altarian outrage? Zethic had found himself without an answer. The truth was that most Federation citizens had been either ignorant of the human situation or actively supportive of it. Cheap goods and free labor had made life comfortable for everyone except the humans themselves. There were some who objected, he had said weakly. A handful, Thomas had agreed. Perhaps 1 in a million. We've identified them, actually. They'll be spared what's coming. And the rest? Thomas had smiled, and Zethic had seen the cold mathematics of extinction in his expression. The rest will learn what it means to be helpless. They had shown him the plan then, in all its terrible completeness. It wasn't a military campaign in any conventional sense. It was systematic dismantlement of galactic civilization, performed with the precision of a master craftsman taking apart a complex machine. Phase 1 was already underway. Human agents had infiltrated every major government, every military command, every critical infrastructure hub across the Federation. They had spent decades learning the weaknesses of their enemies, mapping their dependencies, and preparing for the moment when their patience finally ran out. Phase 2 would begin simultaneously across 17 star systems. Key military installations would simply stop working. Not destroyed, not damaged, just rendered inoperative by humans who understood alien technology better than its creators did. Fleets would find themselves stranded in space, their engines dead and their weapons offline. Phase 3 would target the infrastructure that kept galactic civilization functioning. Trade routes would be severed, communication networks would go dark. The carefully balanced economy that allowed dozens of species to coexist would collapse in a matter of days. And Phase 4? Phase 4 is where it gets interesting, Thomas had said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible purpose. That's when we introduce our friends to the concept of accountability. He had shown Zethic the tribunal ships, massive vessels designed to serve as mobile courts for the prosecution of war crimes. Each one was staffed with human judges who had spent decades studying the legal systems of their enemies, learning their laws, their precedents, their own definitions of justice. We're going to try them using their own legal frameworks, Jake had explained. Every theft will be prosecuted under Valerian commercial law. Every murder will be judged according to Sleen military justice. Every act of slavery will be evaluated using Altarian civil statutes. That's impossible. The legal systems of different species are incompatible. Are they? Thomas had asked. We've spent 60 cycles studying them, Commander, and do you know what we found? They all have one thing in common. They all define the systematic exploitation of other species as a capital offense. The irony had been devastating in its simplicity. The Federation species had condemned themselves using their own laws, their own moral frameworks, their own definitions of civilized behavior. They had built a legal system that explicitly forbade the very actions they had been committing against humanity for 60 cycles. "The tribunals will be thorough," Thomas had continued. "Every individual who participated in crimes against humanity will be given a fair trial according to the legal standards of their own species. They'll be provided with competent legal counsel, access to all relevant evidence, and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. And those found guilty will face the penalties prescribed by their own justice systems for their crimes. We're not imposing human law on alien species, Commander. We're simply ensuring that their own laws are applied fairly and consistently." It was, Zethic had realized, the most comprehensive act of revenge in galactic history disguised as a legal procedure. The humans weren't planning to conquer the Federation. They were planning to prosecute it out of existence using its own rules. "How long?" Zethic had asked. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day we realized what you really thought of us," Thomas had replied. "Did you know that the Terran Federation was originally just a trading consortium? We never intended to become a military power. All we wanted was to participate in galactic commerce, share our discoveries, learn from other species." "What changed?" "The first time one of your ships fired on a human civilian transport," Jake had said quietly. "The first time we realized that our goodwill was being mistaken for weakness. The first time we understood that peace was only possible between equals. So you decided to become our equals." Thomas had laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "No, Commander. We decided to become your superiors." They had kept Zethic aboard their ship for the next several weeks, showing him the scope and scale of human preparation. He had seen factories that produced matter from pure energy. He had witnessed soldiers who could survive in hard vacuum without protection. He had watched human children learning subjects that would make Federation scientists weep with envy. Humanity hadn't just been preparing for war, they had been evolving for it. "How is any of this possible?" Zethic had asked during one of his conversations with Jake. "Your species shouldn't be capable of this level of technological advancement." "Who told you what our species was capable of?" Jake had replied. "The same people who told you we were cowards? The same people who said we were primitive?" The question had hung in the air like an accusation. Everything the Federation knew about humanity had come from human sources. Scientists who had shared their research freely, diplomats who had answered every question with apparent honesty, traders who had provided detailed information about their worlds and capabilities. All of it had been lies. Careful, calculated deceptions designed to make their enemies underestimate them until it was too late to matter. "You've been studying us for 60 cycles," Zethic had said slowly, "learning our weaknesses, our fears, our blind spots." "We've been learning how to hurt you," Jake had corrected. "There's a difference. And now you think you're ready." Jake had been quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars through the ship's viewport. When he finally spoke, his voice had carried the weight of accumulated grief and rage. "Ready? Commander, we've been ready since the day the first human child died in a Valerian labor camp, since the day the first human scientist was vivisected for Sleen medical research, since the day the first human colony was bombed for Altarian entertainment. Then why wait? Why spend 60 cycles gathering intelligence when you could have acted immediately?" "Because we needed to be sure," Thomas had said, joining the conversation as he often did when philosophical questions arose. "We needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. We needed to map every crime, identify every perpetrator, catalogue every injustice. And now you have." "Now we have," Thomas had confirmed. "And now it's time to collect on the debts that are owed." The return journey to Valerian space had taken only hours, a trip that should have required days using conventional hyperspace routes. Jake's ship had moved through dimensions that Federation science claimed were purely theoretical, arriving at coordinates that had been precisely calculated for maximum psychological impact. They had emerged from their impossible voyage directly above the Valerian homeworld, their ship's signature announcing their presence to every sensor array in the system. Within minutes, they had been surrounded by the planetary defense fleet, 200 ships, all armed and ready for battle. "This is Admiral Krosk of Valerian Home Defense," a voice had crackled across the communication channels. "Unknown vessel, identify yourself and state your business." Thomas had activated the ship's transmitter, his voice carrying clearly across every frequency. "This is Thomas of the Terran Federation. I'm here to discuss terms." "Terms?" Admiral Krosk had sounded genuinely confused. "Terms for what?" "The peaceful surrender of your government to face trial for crimes against humanity." The silence that had followed had been deafening. Zethic could imagine the chaos that was probably erupting across the Valerian command structure as they tried to process what they were hearing. "You are one ship against our entire defense fleet," Admiral Krosk had finally responded. "What makes you think you can dictate terms to us?" "The same thing that made me think I could hunt down 500 of your warships with nothing but a maintenance technician and a small craft," Thomas had replied calmly. Another silence, longer this time. Zethic could picture Admiral Krosk checking his tactical displays, confirming what his sensors were telling him about the fleet that Jake had single-handedly dismantled. "What do you want?" Krosk had asked, his voice notably quieter. "Justice," Thomas had said. "For 60 cycles, your people have committed atrocities against mine. We have documented every crime, identified every perpetrator, and calculated the appropriate restitution. You have one option: submit to trial under your own legal framework and accept the consequences of your actions." "And if we refuse?" Thomas had smiled, and even though the Admiral couldn't see his expression, something in his tone had conveyed the deadly promise behind it. "Then you'll discover why Jake was the least dangerous human I could have sent to collect you." The negotiation had continued for hours, but the outcome had never really been in doubt. The Valerians could fight, certainly. They could turn their homeworld into a fortress and prepare for a siege that might last cycles. But they had seen what Jake alone could accomplish, and the thought of facing whatever Thomas might unleash in response to continued resistance had proven too terrible to contemplate. The Valerian High Command had capitulated by sunset. The trial had been educational, conducted according to Valerian law, presided over by Valerian judges, and prosecuted using evidence gathered from Valerian archives. It had been a masterpiece of legal precision. The humans had simply ensured that the law was applied fairly and completely, without the usual exceptions and exemptions that had allowed the atrocities to continue for so long. The verdicts had been unanimous: guilty on all counts. The sentences had been carried out according to Valerian tradition: exile to the prison world of Kythera, where the convicted would spend the remainder of their lives contemplating their crimes. It was a fate many of them had imposed on human prisoners over the years, never imagining that they might someday experience it themselves. But even as justice was being served, Zethic had found himself haunted by a question that none of his human hosts seemed willing to answer directly. "What happens next?" he had asked Thomas during one of their evening conversations. "Next?" Thomas had considered the question carefully. "Next, we move on to the Sleen Empire, then the Altarians, then every other species that decided human suffering was an acceptable price for their comfort." "How many more Jakes do you have?" Thomas had smiled, but there had been sadness in his expression. "Commander, Jake isn't special. He's not enhanced or modified or unique in any way. He's just human." "I don't understand." "Every human can do what Jake does," Thomas had explained. "The ability to move undetected, to disable technology with a touch, to make our enemies simply stop existing. These aren't superhuman powers, Commander. They're just what we are." The revelation had hit Zethic like a physical blow. "All of them?" "Every human. Every adult human, yes. It's part of our basic physiology, as natural to us as breathing. We just spent 60 cycles pretending we didn't have these abilities because we thought it would make you more comfortable around us." "But that's impossible. The Federation has studied human biology extensively." "The Federation has studied what we allowed them to study," Thomas had interrupted. "Do you really think we would reveal our true capabilities to people who were already exploiting us?" Zethic had thought about Jake, walking through Valerian ships and making their crews simply cease to exist. He had thought about the missing vessels, the impossible technology, the casual way the humans discussed reshaping galactic civilization. "How many of you are there?" he had whispered. "Really?" Thomas had walked to the chamber's main display, bringing up a star chart that showed human space in its true extent. Not the handful of systems the Federation had catalogued, but hundreds of worlds, thousands of installations, populations that numbered in the hundreds of billions. "Enough," Thomas had said simply. The conversation had ended there, but the implications had continued to reverberate through Zethic's consciousness for days afterward. If every human possessed abilities that bordered on the supernatural, if their technology was centuries ahead of anything the Federation could produce, if their population was orders of magnitude larger than anyone had suspected, the galaxy was about to change in ways that no one could predict or prevent. The trial of the Valerian High Command had concluded with sentences that would echo through history. But as Zethic had watched the convicted being led away to their exile, he had realized that this was just the beginning. Thomas had approached him one final time before his departure. "You have a choice to make, Commander," the human had said. "You can return to your people and warn them about what's coming. You can try to prepare them, help them understand the magnitude of their crimes and the justice that awaits them. And if I do, then perhaps some of them will survive what's coming next." Zethic had been provided with a ship, a small Valerian courier that had been modified with human technology to make it faster than anything in the Federation fleet. He had been given detailed records of every crime committed against humanity, along with video evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. "Why are you letting me go?" he had asked as he prepared to depart. "Because someone needs to tell the story," Thomas had replied. "Someone needs to explain to the galaxy why this is happening, why it was always going to happen, and why nothing they do now can stop it. You want them to know it's coming? We want them to understand that they brought it on themselves." The journey back to Valerian space had taken Zethic 3 days, during which he had reviewed the evidence over and over, trying to find some flaw in the human case, some argument that might mitigate the coming judgment. He had found none. Every document was authentic. Every image was verified. Every testimony was corroborated by multiple sources. The humans had built an ironclad case for genocide, not their own, but the systematic destruction of their people by supposedly civilized species who had hidden their crimes behind bureaucracy and diplomatic language. When he had finally arrived at Valerian Command and delivered his report, the response had been predictable. Denial, anger, attempts to discredit both the evidence and the messenger. Some officials had accused him of being brainwashed by human technology. Others had suggested that the entire experience had been an elaborate hoax designed to destabilize Federation unity. But the smart ones, the ones who had read the reports and understood their implications, had begun making quiet preparations for what was coming. It hadn't been enough. The Sleen Empire had fallen in a single day. Their entire military had simply stopped functioning as human agents activated sabotage systems that had been placed years in advance. Their government had been transported bodily to Terran space for trial, leaving behind a population that was slowly coming to terms with the scope of their leaders' crimes. The Altarians had lasted longer, almost a week, before their resistance collapsed. Their warrior culture had demanded that they fight to the end, but fighting required weapons that worked and ships that could move. When their technology betrayed them at the moment of greatest need, they had found themselves as helpless as the human children they had once murdered for entertainment. One by one, the great powers of the Federation had fallen, not conquered, not destroyed, but simply neutralized. Stripped of the ability to project power beyond their own worlds, forced to confront the consequences of 60 cycles of systematic brutality. And through it all, the humans had maintained their facade of civilized legal procedure. Every action was justified by existing Federation law. Every sentence was carried out according to established precedent. Every prosecution was conducted with scrupulous attention to due process. It was justice, served cold and absolute. The trial of the Federation Council itself had been broadcast across the galaxy, a spectacle that had drawn viewers from every inhabited world. The proceedings had been conducted in the Council's own chambers, presided over by their own judges, and prosecuted according to their own rules of evidence. The humans had simply ensured that the law was applied without favor or exception. The verdicts had been handed down after 7 days of testimony that had laid bare the scope and scale of the crimes committed against humanity. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit genocide, systematic enslavement, crimes against sentience. The sentences had been death. Not the clean, quick death of an energy weapon, but the slow, inevitable death of a civilization that had lost the moral authority to govern. The Federation Council had been dissolved, its authority transferred to a new body, composed entirely of the species they had once victimized. Humanity had not sought to rule this new order. They had simply ensured that those who did rule would remember the cost of cruelty. Zethic had watched the proceedings from his quarters aboard a human observation vessel, trying to process the transformation that had swept across the galaxy in a matter of weeks. The old order was gone, swept away like debris before a solar wind. In its place was something new, something that prioritized justice over convenience and accountability over profit. It should have felt like victory. The corrupt officials who had enabled 60 cycles of atrocities were gone. The systems that had allowed such exploitation were being dismantled and rebuilt. The voices of the oppressed were finally being heard. But as Zethic had watched species after species submit to human judgment, he had found himself wondering if they had simply traded one form of tyranny for another. The question had troubled him enough that he had finally sought out Thomas for one last conversation. "What happens now?" Zethic had asked. "When the trials are over, when the guilty have been punished, when the new government is established, what happens to humanity? What happens to the power you've accumulated?" Thomas had been quiet for a long time, staring out at the stars with an expression that Zethic couldn't read. "That," Thomas had said finally, "is the question that keeps me awake at night." "You don't know." "We know what we want to happen," Thomas had replied. "We want to step back, return to our own space, and let the galaxy rebuild itself according to better principles. We want to go home and try to heal the wounds that 60 cycles of oppression have left on our people." But power is easier to take than it is to give away," Thomas had admitted. "And there are some among my people who believe that the galaxy cannot be trusted to govern itself without human oversight. They want to rule. They want to ensure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else. And they believe that the only way to guarantee that is to maintain permanent human control over galactic affairs." Zethic had felt a chill run through his scales. "And what do you believe?" Thomas had turned to face him, and Zethic had seen something in his eyes that was almost like hope. "I believe that every species deserves the chance to prove that they can be better than their worst impulses," Thomas had said. "But I also believe that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild." "So what will you do?" "I don't know," Thomas had admitted, "but I suspect that decision won't be mine to make." The conversation had ended there, but its implications had continued to haunt Zethic as he prepared for his final departure from human space. He had been given passage back to the Federation, or what remained of it, along with a mission that felt both vitally important and utterly hopeless. "Tell them what you've seen," Thomas had instructed. "Tell them what humanity is capable of, and what we've chosen not to do. Tell them that the age of exploitation is over, and that what comes next depends entirely on the choices they make now. And if they choose poorly." Thomas had smiled, but there had been no warmth in the expression. "Then they'll discover that Jake was just the beginning." As Zethik's ship had departed human space, carrying him back toward an uncertain future, he had found himself thinking about names and the promises they contained. The humans had never chosen an epithet for themselves when they joined the Federation. They had simply allowed others to define them, to categorize them, to reduce them to a convenient stereotype. But now, as he flew through space that had been swept clean of Federation authority, Zethik thought he finally understood what the humans should be called. They were those who remember. And as his ship approached the shattered remnants of the Galactic Council, carrying news that would reshape the balance of power across the galaxy, Zethik couldn't help but wonder what other promises were hidden in the names that species chose for themselves. Behind him, in the depths of human space, 500 empty Valerian ships drifted in perfect formation around a maintenance technician named Jake, who sat alone in his small craft and contemplated the weight of choices yet to be made. The galaxy had learned what humans were capable of when pushed too far, but they had yet to discover what humans might become when they stopped pretending to be something they weren't. And in the silence between the stars, Jake smiled and began plotting coordinates for his next destination. The hunt was over. The reckoning had just begun. Thomas was older than Jake, with grey hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent carrying impossible burdens. But there was a weight to his presence that made the air itself seem heavier, as if reality bent slightly around him. "Commander Zethik," Thomas had said, his voice carrying easily across the vast chamber. "Thank you for accepting our invitation." "Invitation?" Zethik had laughed bitterly. "I was captured." "You were given a choice," Thomas had corrected gently. "Jake could have left you to die in that escape pod. Instead, he brought you here so you could see what your actions have wrought." Thomas had gestured to the displays around them, showing the real-time status of human operations across the galaxy. Ships were moving, resources were being relocated, and populations were being prepared for something. "What are you planning?" Zethik had asked. "Justice," Thomas had replied simply. "For 60 cycles, your people have treated us like animals. You've stolen our resources, murdered our civilians, and enslaved our children, and all the while you've told yourselves that it was acceptable because we were too weak to stop you. So you're going to wage war against the entire galaxy." "Thomas,"